Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Labassi.
And I'm Dylan Martineau. We and a few off-screen members are the members of the Veterans Writing community.
It's December 2nd, and we are here at Mount Carmel Veterans Service Center for the first of our Thursday community events on how to tell a true war story. Today, we will be exploring the question, what is truth? If you like what we do here, please give us a like, subscribe, and a share, and consider donating to us on Cash App at $Writing Veterans.
So we're going to post a check-in question just to see who's out there. And our check-in question is, well, it's not really a question. Tell us your favorite clean joke or riddle. So feel free to post it in the comments at any time. That's you.
During this event, we will be writing for a total of 15 minutes. Please have something to write on and write with. We will be talking as write as being therapeutic, but we are not therapists, and today's writing is not meant to be taken as therapy or its substitute. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments during any time during the session. We'd love to have you involved in our conversation.
Yeah, don't feel like you're interrupting us. But one of the things we love to do is write, and we write in sprints. So what we're going to do is introduce a 5-minute sprint. A sprint is where we set a timer, we give a couple of prompts, and then we write for 5 minutes without stopping. Total stream of consciousness. So we're going to write about how did you travel to school when you were young, or you could choose write about a past deployment or trip and what makes it come to mind. So we're going to pull up a 5-minute timer, and the idea is to not go back, don't reread, don't change things, don't edit, just write for 5 minutes without stopping. Ready, go. 1 minute left.
All right, everybody, that is time. So go ahead and dot your I's, cross your T's, add any punctuation you think is absolutely necessary,
Or none if you don't want any.
or more than you think is necessary if you're feeling froggy. So today we are going to go ahead and get started with a reading, and we are going to be doing some readings out of the book, The Things They Carried by the author Tim O'Brien. And the first thing we're going to read is a story called Ambush. So Natalie's going to go ahead and put that on the screen for you so that you can read along with us. So, Ambush. When she was 9, my daughter Kathleen asked if I had ever killed anyone. She knew about the war. She knew I'd been a soldier. You keep writing these stories, she said. So I guess you must have killed somebody. It was a difficult moment, but I did what seemed was right, which was to say, of course not. And then to take her onto my lap and hold her for a while. Someday I hope she'll ask again. But here, I want to pretend she's a grown-up. I want to tell her exactly what happened, or what I remember happening. And then I want to say to her as a little girl she was absolutely right. This is why I keep writing war stories. He was a short, slender young man of about 20. I was afraid of him, afraid of something. And as he passed me on the trail, I threw a grenade that exploded at his feet and killed him. Or to go back. Shortly after midnight, we moved into the ambush site outside my key. The whole platoon was there, spread out in the dense brush along the trail. And for 5 hours, nothing at all happened. We were working in 2-man teams, one man on guard while the other slept, switching off every 2 hours. And I remember it was still dark when Kiowa shook me awake for the final watch. The night was foggy and hot. For the first few moments, I felt lost, not sure about the direction, groping for my helmet and weapon. I reached out and found 3 grenades and lined them up in front of me. The pins had already been straightened for quick throwing. And then, for maybe half an hour, I kneeled there and waited. Very gradually, in tiny slivers, dawn began to break through the fog. And from my position in the brush, I could see 10 or 15 meters up the trail. The mosquitoes were fierce. I remember slapping them, wondering if I should wake up Kiowa and ask for some repellent, then thinking it was a bad idea, then looking up and seeing the young man come out of the fog. He wore black clothing and rubber sandals and a gray ammunition belt. His shoulders were slightly stooped and his head cocked to the side as if listening for something. He seemed at ease. He carried his weapon in one hand, muzzled down, moving without any hurry up the center of the trail. There was no sound at all, none that I can remember. In a way, it seemed he was part of the morning fog, or my own imagination. But there was also the reality of what was happening in my stomach. I had already pulled the pin on a grenade. I had come up to a crouch. It was entirely automatic. I did not hate the young man. I did not see him as the enemy. I did not ponder issues of morality or politics or military duty. I crouched and kept my head low. I tried to swallow whatever was rising from my stomach, which tasted like lemonade. tasted like lemonade, something fruity and sour. I was terrified. There was no thought about killing. The grenade was just to make him go away, just evaporate. And I leaned back and felt my mind go empty and then felt it fill up again. I had already thrown the grenade before telling myself to throw it. The brush was thick and I had to lob it high, not aiming. And I remember the grenade seeming to freeze above me for an instant, as if a camera had clicked. And I remember ducking down and holding my breath and seeing little wisps of fog rise from the earth. The grenade bounced once and rolled across the trail. I did not hear it, but there must have been a sound because the young man dropped his weapon and began to run just 2 or 3 quick steps. And then he hesitated, swiveling to his right, and he glanced down at the grenade and tried to cover his head, but never did. It occurred to me then that he was about to die. I wanted to warn him. The grenade made a popping noise, not soft, but not loud either. Not what I'd expected. And there was a puff of dust and smoke, a small white puff, and the young man seemed to jerk upward as if pulled by invisible wires. He fell on his back. His rubber sandals had been blown off. There was no wind. He lay at the center of the trail, his right leg bent beneath him, one eye shut, the other a huge star-shaped hole. It was not a matter of live or die. There was no real peril. Almost certainly, the young man would have passed by. And it will always be that way. Later, I remember, Kiowa tried to tell me that the man would have died anyway. He told me it was a good kill and that I was a soldier and this was a war, that I should shape up and stop staring and ask myself what the dead man would have done if things were reversed. None of it mattered. The words seemed far too complicated. All I could do was gape at the fact of the young man's body. Even now, I haven't finished sorting it out. Sometimes I forgive myself. Other times I don't. In the ordinary hours of life, I try not to dwell on it. But now and then, when I'm reading a newspaper or just sitting alone in a room, I'll look up and I'll see the young man come out of the morning fog. I'll watch him walk toward me, his shoulders slightly stooped, his head cocked to the side. And he'll pass within a few yards of me and suddenly smile at some secret thought, and then continue up the trail to where it bends back into the fog. So that is Ambush. And I got to say, it's one of my favorite stories out of the things they carried. Not because of what is talked about, but how it's talked about. It's definitely a difficult story to get through. It's a hard story to get through as someone who's been in situations similar to this.
So how does this fit into the major theme of what is truth?
So one of the things that sticks with me is that when my buddies and I tell war stories together, some of them are funny, some of them aren't. Some of them are people wouldn't understand why they're being told. But war stories don't all have to do with killing, like as in here. War stories just have to do with life. And so, like in this story, and like the stories that my friends and I swap, the war story is a large part of the war story is in the telling. And so it's not necessarily in the actual message. There may not even be a message present, but it's in the telling and the journey of it. And so part of this being a war story is just having the reader take a journey with O'Brien in his past.
And I know we've talked in the past about how truth takes different forms. There's the story truth and the happening truth. So, and I know we're going to kind of get into that in a little bit, but I just think it's interesting how when you read something for the first time, especially something as graphic as Ambush, you look at it and you think, oh my gosh, that is horrible, and that happened, and you look at it as the truth. You take it for granted that what's coming forward is not fiction. And so
in this story, O'Brien is kind of doing two major things. The first is that it's this struggle of ownership. And so his daughter, Kathleen, asked him, hey, Dad, did you do this thing while you were at war? Because you seem to really be bothered by some things. And because she's young, he tells her, no, I never did anything bad, right? I didn't do things to hurt people. It's fine. Don't worry about it.
Well, she was little though, like
Well,
six.
and she was little, but it's
Yeah.
still a struggle of ownership. He lied to his kid. It doesn't matter what it is. It's a lie. And so why is he telling her the lie though? Is it because she's a child, or is it because he doesn't want his daughter at this age to be exposed to the things that he did? That's
Or maybe he's afraid that he doesn't want to shatter her image of him.
It could be any or all of these
change
things.
the way she views him.
But it all comes down to ownership. And this is both a owning of his actions. I did a thing, but at the same time, it's a displacement of that actions. He did it and he's owning it in the story, but he's owning it in the future for Kathleen to read. He's not owning it in the moment. In the moment, he's displacing it. Daddy, did you ever kill anyone? No. I hope she asks in the future, because in the future, maybe we'll both be ready.
Yeah, so maybe that's what it comes down to, is that the truth that comes forward is the truth that you're ready for. And sometimes it takes people a long time to, tell the difference between, okay, this is what I remember happening. This is a sequence of events, of things that happened to me in my life. And kind of unpacking that stuff that's kind of emotion based. It takes a long time to process, and working that into what becomes the truth later. I think that's why writing is so helpful, because once you write it, you process it into language that you can go back and read, and it sort of solidifies. And rather than having the images flash through your mind a bunch of times, and it doesn't even have to be a traumatic event. It can be anything. But instead of that thing being on your mind all the time, a lot of times getting it on the page can kind of give it its own space.
Yeah,
and
that's how it is for me. With the two things that I published, they both kind of deeply affected me, and they used to affect me. They don't affect me anymore. Like the problems that I wrote about in Deeper Than Bone and in Girls in the Alley, I don't struggle with those problems anymore because I wrote it down and I left it on the page. It doesn't live in my mind anymore. It lives on the page, and it lives in the minds of other people when they choose to read it. And so,
yeah, and there's a lot of science that backs that up too, that expressive writing, even if you just write for 5 minutes, 10 minutes about whatever's on your mind, can really help.
But even then, part of being able to leave it on the page was being able to tell my version, if you will, of the truth. And it wasn't necessarily the factual events. It's a little closer to what O'Brien does here. And here are the events, but here are the events how I remember them. It's not how I know they must have played out, because some of the stuff that I remember just couldn't logically happen. It doesn't matter if it logically happened or not. It's what traumatically affects me. It's what affects my mind, and it's what keeps me up at night when it keeps me up.
It's got a much more emotional base to it than it does, words on a page. And I think that's what we kind of want to get at with this whole series, and especially this, what is truth? Is it fact-based or is it emotion-based? And I think it's ultimately going to be kind of a blending of the two. So,
speaking about getting words on paper, feel like another sprint?
Yeah, I think we should. So this time, instead of sprinting for 5 minutes, we're going to sprint for 10 minutes. And we're going to give you some different prompts to think about. So you can either continue on with the prompt that you have been working with, or you can switch to a total new one. So we have two different ones for you. This time you could write about a story about finding life meaning in an unexpected place, or you could write about a nickname someone had while you were serving or when you were younger, and who named them? How did they get the name? So hopefully this will give you some inspiration to write about some interesting things. And we're going to set the timer and go for 10 minutes this time.
Look out the window. 5 minutes left. We are halfway through.
A little less than 1 minute left.
All right, that's about time. Go ahead and wrap things up. and we're going to go ahead and get started on our next reading. So our next reading again comes out of The Things They Carried, and this is a story called Good Form. All right. It's time to be blunt. I'm 43 years old. True. And I'm a writer now. And a long time ago, I walked through Quang Ngai province as a foot soldier. Almost everything else is invented. But it's not a game, it's a form. Right here, now, as I invent myself, I'm thinking of all I want to tell you about why this book is written as it is. For instance, I want to tell you this. 20 years ago, I watched a man die on a trail near the village of Mai Ki. I did not kill him, but I was present, you see. In my presence was guilt enough. I remember his face, which was not a pretty face because his jaw was in his throat. And I remember feeling the burden of responsibility and grief. I blamed myself, and rightly so, because I was present. But listen, even that story is made up. I want you to feel what I felt. I want you to know why story truth is sometimes truer than happening truth. Here's the happening truth. I was once a soldier. There were many bodies, real bodies with real faces. But I was young then, and I was afraid to look. And now, 20 years later, I'm left with faceless responsibility and faceless grief. Here's the story truth. He was a slim, dead, almost dainty young man of about 20. He lay in the center of a red clay trail near the village of Mai Ki. His jaw was in his throat. His one eye was shut, the other eye was a star-shaped hole. I killed him. What stories can do, I guess, is make things present. I can look at things I never looked at. I can attach faces to grief and love and pity and God. I can be brave. I can make myself feel again. Daddy, tell the truth, Kathleen can say. Did you ever kill anybody? And I can say honestly, of course not. Or I can say honestly, yes. Need a second here?
Yeah, that reading is pretty powerful. One of the things that I really like about that is that he's got that faceless grief. And so we were talking before about how truth can be the happening truth or the story truth, but it can be based on actual facts that happened and your perspective of those facts as they happened, or they could be a deeper truth. And sometimes, not necessarily based on fact, but based on emotion and based on the story truth, the getting at what's the underlying truth.
Yeah, and the thing to remember here is that both of these stories are true. One just happens to be historically true, and one happens to be cognitively true. One actually happened in a historical event, and it happened, and in the other, it's what the author goes through, regardless of the historicity of the events. And so, at the surface, when you read these two stories together, it again seems a bit like a struggle to tell the truth, because in Ambush, he starts off by admitting he killed or by denying to his daughter that he killed somebody, and then admitting it and graphically telling the story. And then here he is telling the readers, yeah, but none of that even actually happened. And so it seems to be this denial or this struggle for O'Brien to tell the truth.
But yet he takes ownership of it.
He takes ownership, but it does seem to be a struggle to tell the truth. until you realize that there is not one set truth that the author is experiencing. The author is experiencing both sets of these truths simultaneously. He knows he never actually committed the act of killing someone in combat, but he was surrounded by those actions. He was surrounded by people who did take life, and he was present. And that was enough for him to feel guilt associated with those actions. And so the truth is that O'Brien never actually killed anyone, according to this book. The truth is that O'Brien, according to this book, feels like he killed someone. And just because he may not have actually historically taken a life doesn't mean that he does not feel guilt and pain even to this day from
responsibility.
That. Yeah, it's part of why I wrote some of the things that I did, because I felt a similar guilt. To the best of my knowledge, I have never taken life, but I've tried to. And just the act of trying to hurts years down the road. And so,
well, and I wonder if that's not, something that people struggle with a lot, is that, you're trained to take lives, and then you spend, I don't know if I don't want to use the word a person is trained to take lives as part of combat, but may struggle with the idea that taking a life is against their moral beliefs.
That's certainly one facet of it. So what Dylan's describing is something called a moral injury, where we have been ingrained morally that a certain set of actions are or are not acceptable. And then we're placed in positions where those actions happen regardless of how we morally feel about them, and we're left with the aftermath. But this can happen to firefighters. This can happen to paramedics. It does happen to firefighters. It does happen to paramedics. Like it's not something that's solely in the realm of combat. Like, you have these story truths and happening truths in every single facet of every single person's life. Like, there's always going to be here's what actually happened, and then here's how I feel about it. And you can change how you feel about things sometimes. Some of the really deeply ingrained things that you feel you may not be able to change easily or ever. Like, O'Brien stated that he's struggling with this at, 43 years old? He was in his 20s. This is 20-something years down the road, and O'Brien's still struggling with it.
But it's really got that juxtaposition in it too. I can say honestly yes, and I can say honestly no.
Yeah, both of these are true. And there's story truth and there's happening truth. And they can be the same, but they don't have to be. And usually they are not.
Well, and I think what makes it really interesting is that, and this is part of what we do in the veterans writing community, is we help veterans tell their own stories. And so coming forward with the idea that, you can write down what happened, and that helps. But writing about how you feel about what happened, getting your own perspective of your part in what happened, can sometimes give you the distance enough to look back at your words and say, this is the truth, and this is the truth. So no matter what you're writing about, that is, and when they use the term your truth, it seems kind of trite nowadays, but there really is, I think, a separation, but yet not a separation at the same time.
Yeah. So one of the really interesting things about memory and recall is every time you recall a memory, it changes a little bit. Doesn't matter what the memory is. Doesn't matter how visceral that experience was. Every time you recall a memory, it changes just a little bit. But when you recall a memory to write it down, you yourself are purposely changing it, because words are limited. Words can do great and vast things, but you can't put exactly how you feel into words. You can't always put exactly a series or a connected group of events together in a way that really makes sense and have it be how it truly historically happened.
Mhm.
And so there's
And
always
that's
going to be
because
changes.
memory doesn't work that way. Memory does not, you don't recall memories
Well,
in
it's
the
not even
order
be-
that they happen.
it's not even because memory doesn't work that way. It's because language doesn't work that way. You
True.
can't describe an airplane crash with words and truly describe it. We can describe facets of it, but you can never truly encapsulate that experience, right? And so there's always going to be this translation, this I went through this event and now I have to write it in a way that you can understand it. It's a translation. Something changes, something is lost and something is gained. But in this act of writing something down, because one, we don't remember things the way that they exactly happen, because the memory changes every time we recall it. Then on top of it, because we're writing it down, because language is imperfect, we're actually changing the events in our own mind. And so when you write down an event that truly happened to you, and you write it down multiple times, multiple ways, you explore it from multiple angles, you're actually changing how you yourself cognitively remember and process that event in the first place.
And that connects to storytelling too, because when you tell a story, it's different every time too. And so how you remember things and what is true in one version of a story may be shifted or just because your perspective changes. I mean, let's say you tell the story of an experience that you had, and then a couple years later, you tell somebody else the same story. It's not going to be the same at all. It's still going to be true. It's just going to be really different because, you're in a different situation. You're telling it to a different person. You are the expectations for the outcome of the response that you want from telling the story are going to be different. And that's what makes it different, I think, storytelling different from writing it. Because when you write it, it becomes kind of permanent. And you can look at it over the years. And, let's say you write something down and you stick it in a drawer for a couple years, 10 years, and then you go back and you look at it, you're going to, the way you look at it is going to be the truth of the way you look at it. You're going to see that truth differently too. And because you'll have years of experience and you'll have ideas and things that you have learned since you wrote that. And so you'll view it differently too, which is why I think expressive writing is important for lots of reasons, not just because getting it out of your head and onto paper is helpful, but because reading it years later down the line makes you realize the way you were thinking at the time. And that is truth in its own truth in itself.
So shall we take a look at the tenets?
Yeah, so we at the Veterans Writing Community have 4 tenets that we kind of base all of our writing on. And our first one is, what do you want your words to do? So if you are writing and you're talking about things, if you're thinking, well, maybe I'll share these with somebody, or maybe I'm going to do something with these words. What is the purpose for your writing? What do you want your words to do? What effect do you want them to have? So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So with O'Brien and his writing, with these 2 stories, what I think O'Brien wanted to do was explore what it means to tell a true story. And if I remember correctly, and I may not be, these are 2 stories that he wrote specifically for this book. So most of the stories in the things they carried were actually previously published elsewhere. And maybe definitely less than half the stories were produced just for this book. So I think he specifically saw what he had written previously and decided, all right, this is good. There are some really solid stories that were previously written, like How to Tell a True War Story, the things they carried. But what does it mean to really tell a true war story? O'Brien explores that in the story, but he doesn't really explore what truth is. And so I think he wrote Ambush and Good Form to explore for himself and others what truth means.
Yeah, which is why they make such a great example.
which is why I think they pair so well together.
Yeah, they do. So if someone were writing for, if they're experimenting with writing as a form of self-expression, for example, if they're just thinking, well, um, I've got some pain, I've got some trauma, I've got some things that I know I have things I need to deal with. I have issues, as they say, and they decide to try writing. I think this is a good question to ask yourself. Once you're done kind of purging it and getting it out there, it's a good question to ask. What do you want your words to do? And whether or not you are willing to share those words with somebody else is irrelevant at that point. I think it's just really, if you want those words to do something, what is that thing? Our next tenet is your message clear?
And so within these two stories, it's kind of hard to say because the stories themselves kind of conflict. And so you can say that the message of the stories conflict, and since they conflict, they're not clear. But when you look at what at least I think that they're meant to do, there's clarity when you look at them together. And so you need to kind of understand things beyond just the boundaries of those individual stories. And so in some ways you need to connect the two together, or other parts of the things they carried, other parts of O'Brien's book. But O'Brien's clear, at least in good form, that there are two kinds of truth that he experiences. And so it's not quite as clear. It's not clear at all in Ambush, but that clarity comes from good form.
Yeah, and considering them together.
And considering them together. And these really aren't meant to be just as one-offs. Like if you read something from the things they carried, you should read a lot more than just one thing from the things they carried. One, it's a book, right? It's not meant to necessarily have a single item pulled from it and looked at on its own.
Well, and what's really interesting about that book is that when I read it, first page to the last page the first time through. And then the next time I read it, I randomly opened it and I read something. And then I randomly opened it and read something else. And you get a totally different experience by doing that, because all of the vignettes that are in there are kind of intertwined. And so you get a different perspective. Many of them are written about the same event, but just from different perspectives. And so I think that's something that we could put forward as part of that tenet. Is your message clear? Well, maybe it will gain clarity if you write about it from different perspectives, or write about it with different goals in mind. The clarity will emerge from looking at it from all these different aspects. I know that there's lots of expressive writing experts out there that write about how if you there's an expressive writing technique put out there by James Pennebaker and Josh Smythe that says that if you write for 20 minutes for 3 days in a row, 20 minutes each day, the first time you write just to get the events on the page. And then the next time you write, the next day, you write about how you felt about it. And then the next time you reflect on what you wrote the first 2 times. That way, you get all these different perspectives on, and it really kind of helps you grasp the events that surround that thing a little differently, because you're able to look at it more objectively, and that kind of pulls it out of your head and gets it into a way that you can kind of deal with it a little better. So we say that writing is really cathartic, and I think it's much more cathartic when you take one event and write about it as many different ways as you can. I've had events where I have said, okay, well, what if I wrote from the other person's perspective? If you're having a fight with somebody, or if you're having a disagreement, you could write about it from that person's perspective, or write about it from a bystander's perspective, and get some really interesting insight into the way you're thinking about the event. So let's look at our third tenet. Who is your audience, and should they understand everything?
In respect to these two pieces, I believe that O'Brien's audience was, part of it was is veterans, and specifically Vietnam veterans, people who have had similar experiences, because you can, in one way, these stories are meant to be connection pieces. You are not alone. I've been through this too. But the way that he explains things, especially in good form, it's meant for people who have never been through those experiences and who don't know that there really is a difference between the historical events and how I feel about it. And that one can be the story truth, or one can be the happening truth, and the other can be the story truth, and they can conflict and coincide at the same time. And so O'Brien is writing both to people who need to know they're not alone, but he's also writing to people that need to know this is complicated. This is not easy. This is not just, this is what happens and life goes on from there. No. This is what happened. This is how I feel what happened. And this is how these things conflicting prevent my life from going on from there.
And I think that that's why we put this as the third tenet, because one of the first things I think of as a writer is, who's my audience? That's usually the first thing I think about. But it's the third tenet because what do we want our words to do? And is the message of those words clear? That's something we kind of have to have preloaded before we think about who our audience is. And so do we want our words to have an audience at all is kind of something that, especially if you're, looking at writing as a way to process some events that happened in your life, some trauma, some other things, it may be that you need to set your words in a drawer for a while. Maybe you're just purging it all, and you put it into a diary with a lock on it, and then you put it somewhere where nobody can find it for a while. If all you want those words to do is to get the images out of your head and onto paper, then they have done their job. And whether they're clear or not matters only to you. But if you are going to put it out there to an audience, should they understand everything? I think the operative word there is should they understand everything.
Yeah.
It's not will they understand, because that's not on you as the writer.
That's not something you can necessarily determine. You can't control
you can
do your best, but it all comes down to, when it's in front of them, do the words make sense or not?
Yeah. And then and a lot of it can be left up to interpretation on their part. So let's look at the fourth tenet. Did you leave things out? Why or why not?
So that's a little bit of a more difficult one to approach with this piece, because the story is, at least in part, invented. And so how do you know if you've left out part of an invented story? Well, part of it's going to be like, does the story make sense? Is it a coherent story? If it's not a coherent story, there's probably some key details left out. But these are two very coherent stories. And so how do you really tell in a admittedly fictional story, how do you tell if there's something left out? And to me, it doesn't feel like there is. To me, it feels like both of these are complete, because when I get to the end of these stories, I'm left thinking about what the story's about, rather than things that are left out of the story. And O'Brien does a great job with some of his pieces in making you think about the absent. And that's not present in these two specific pieces. You think about, in Ambush, you think about the things that O'Brien did. And you think about the things that O'Brien said to his daughter, and kind of the what ifs down the road. But they're all tied, at least for me, they're tied to the direct events in the story. And in good form, it's this conflict between the story truth and the happening truth. But I leave the story still thinking about how these two stories work and conflict with each other, rather than something that may be absent from them. So in these two stories, I don't think O'Brien left anything out.
But it also depends on the audience too, which is why that is the third. This is the fourth tenet instead of the third tenet, because with the audience, depending on who the audience is, things might be left out. Like we have, I was thinking about the conversation between O'Brien and his daughter. I'm sure there's lots of things he left out because they were just too complex or too graphic for her to comprehend at the time. But I was also thinking about our good friend Seth Castle, who wrote a couple of series of books for kids about parents with PTSD called Why is Dad So Mad? Why is Mom So Mad? If you consider the audience as kids, and in order to make them understand everything, you're leaving a lot of detail out because you want to get the emotions across to the kids so that they understand what you're saying. There can be some intention in leaving things out too. I'm not saying that Tenet 4 is about did you skip over anything and did you leave a big gaping hole in your story? That's not what that means. I think it means did you tell the story in a way that if you did leave things out, it was intentional.
Yes,
And then why or why not?
definitely.
So speaking of publications, we have a publication called the After Action Review, which is a journal for veterans to publish their work. So as we wrap up here, we want to thank you for spending some time with us. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe.
Remember, you don't have to share your writing with anyone, but if you do want to publish in our journal, the After Action Review, please email us, visit our website to arrange a consultation, and we hope you find that.
We hope that what we did here inspires you to think about writing differently. If any of our ideas did inspire you, please comment below and join us next Thursday for Ambiguity and Clarity, the next in our How to Tell a True War Story series.
And remember, every veteran has a story. Let us help tell yours. Thank you for joining us. Bye.
Bye.